Welcome back to the Badass Literature Society, where badasses come together to rate and review novels recommended by you. Hi, I'm Michael.
This is Barbara.
And I'm Lauren.
We're back for another bonus episode, and today we have a special guest we're very excited to be talking to. We read her debut novel, More Than Life, a YA historical fantasy, in our first episode of Season 5 last month. Please welcome Bethanie Finger.
Hi.
Woo!
Bethanie, you want to introduce yourself to our listeners?
So my name is Bethanie Finger. I am a young adult author. I think I'm most known for being the host and founder of the Prince Kai Fan Pod, a Marissa Meyer podcast. I am also a librarian and a book lover, and most recently a teacher. I don't really have any other fun facts.
That is perfectly okay. Thank you for introducing yourself. We'll go ahead and dive into our interview. Barbara, you want to take the first question?
Yeah, because I totally stole this from Marissa Mayer's question. And I know you already answered this because you were on her podcast, obviously. But I'm going to do it anyway. So, and credit to her, obviously. But what is your author origin story? I just find that question amazing that she put that. And it's one of my favorite things. So I kind of had to steal it and use it here.
I love it. I love it. See, this is the good thing about not having answers prepared. I don't remember exactly what I told her. I know that Perfect. I can say, like, growing up, literature was a part of my household. My mom read to us, like, while we were in the womb. And my father was always, like, playing music and singing music. There was always music in the house or in the car or in the garage. And when I was really little, I started writing my own poems and my own songs. I wrote a poem about our dog that died when I was, like, I think 5 or 6. And then I wrote my first, like, full-length novel. I think it was like 70,000 words when I was 13, which my mama is the only one who's read it. She has told me multiple times how magnificent it is, so it's probably crap. But
Plus,
you know how moms are.
Kind of ironic.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's not an age where you're excelling in your literary skills and prowess. And then I started my querying process. The first time I queried a book, I think I was 17 or 18. And I've queried over the years probably close to 50 projects. Sometimes it's like a collection of poetry. Sometimes it's short stories. But I think it was 16 years. It was 16 years before I finally got the publishing offer. So that's a very long origin story, I guess.
I didn't know that you had been querying since then.
Yeah, it's not something I was very vocal about when I was younger, especially being on the podcast, because I think up until the last maybe 2 to 5 years, the entire concept of how to become a published author was not a typical conversation that people had. And now I feel like it's all over social media and TikTok, and being a self-published author has become very manageable in the digital society when it really wasn't just a few short years ago. So I think it never occurred to me to have that conversation with people, even outside my own circle. Like, I don't even think my husband knows all the books I tried to publish, because at what point do you stop having, oh yeah, I tried again conversation?
Yeah, that's true. And definitely. I feel like TikTok, I think, has really helped that, because I feel like it's word of mouth via TikTok now, or book talk, as we call it. But for all these self-published authors, and I think that's a really cool avenue for people before that we didn't have that option before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it gives them a little bit more credit, hopefully, because I don't think self-published authors get enough credit for all of the work that they do. I don't think people realize that being a self-published author, in my opinion, is harder than being a traditionally published author, because you are literally doing everything yourself. Not just like the marketing, but you're talking about researching the right color of paper and the right, like, density, so the paper is not too thin or too thick, and the right font, the right spacing in between each letter and each word and each line, and all these things that book companies and publishing marketers have already done to identify, like, what's the easiest to visually appeal to a reader. Mm-hmm. Now these published authors all by themselves, they have to do all that work all on their own. And then they have to find the different avenues they can publish, because I think the most common would be Amazon, but there are tons of other options for them. And they have to sort of figure out which one is best. And I have several friends that have self-published, and none of them went the traditional route. They didn't even, I have most of them never even bothered because they wanted to do all of those things themselves. They enjoyed the creative process of it. They enjoyed being a part of those decisions. Whereas for myself, the whole concept of doing it alone was very daunting. And even with my publisher, I still do a lot of the marketing myself, a lot of things like this, like setting up interviews or reaching out to reviewers or podcasters or my social media. But all those little tiny details that never would have occurred to me to worry about what color the paper was or what type of font was used outside of like, that font looks pretty, but it's not about it looking pretty. Is it the right size? Is it a, tone that is appealing to the average person? So just little like nuanced things that never would have occurred to me to even identify.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. I was just like, oh, self-publishing, you have to do all the marketing for yourself, or maybe pick a cool cover. And it's like, what? You have to pick paper and the font? Who knew?
All the things. Who's your favorite author? And are there any authors that you were particularly inspired by? Obviously, I know Marissa Meyer is one of them, because you know that's like one of your faves up there. But would you consider her your favorite? Are there other authors that you've been inspired by?
I think Marissa is definitely my favorite author. I think as a millennial, I have to give credit to J.K. Rowling, even because I was raised on Harry Potter. So
yes.
I can't live in a world where that doesn't have some kind of influence on my entire personality. I think the biggest influence would be, in terms of world building, would be K.M. Shea. She's this brilliant indie author. She writes this series called the Timeless Fairy Tale series. You can find it on Kindle Unlimited. I will warn you, if you start with one book, there's like 17 and you might go down a rabbit hole. I got lost for like an entire 2 weeks when I first found them, and I did nothing but just
Barbara's out then.
Devour those books. They're brilliant. But she has this wonderful world building concept where the world is already established and she sort of just describes it as she goes, as opposed to like a front load of this is what the world looks like. And so when I was writing, I didn't even realize it, but I was sort of channeling that structure while I was describing the location and the places in the story. And it wasn't until she had a new book come out and I kind of stepped back from writing a little bit so I could do nothing but read that book for 16 hours straight that I realized I was following a similar pattern. So she would have been a pretty big influence. And I do highly recommend her work because it's magnificent. So the book is, this author is named K.M. Shea, Shea. And the series is called the Timeless Fairy Tale series. And it's just a bunch of fairy tale retellings. The Rapunzel one is my favorite, but I also really love Snow White and Cinderella. And these are stories that we've read and reread and retold hundreds of times over the years. And I think it's extremely impressive when an author can still manage to make it something new or different.
Yes.
Marissa did that by making them sci-fi, and that was a really big twist. What I find so incredibly compelling about K.M. Shea's work is that they still take place in this sort of historical fantasy medieval vibe. And there's still like a uniqueness to them, something different, something you're not expecting. And it makes it a really great read because then you're constantly like, well, I thought I knew the story of Cinderella. Where is this going? I thought I knew Beauty and the Beast. Why is this character behaving in such a way that makes no sense to what I'm typically used to? So I definitely highly recommend her work.
I feel like you and I've talked about her before, so
probably
for sure. It's to my TBR.
She's a pretty. I'm right up there with Marissa and J.K. Rowling. Yeah,
we'll definitely check out that series. That does sound interesting. Outside of other authors, what would you say has influenced you the most as a writer?
Music by Taylor Swift, probably.
Yes, best answer.
Honorable mention.
No honorable, just mention.
Yeah. There's especially with this series, there's a portion of myself in the book. The series was sort of a grief project after I lost my father, and I was trying to figure out how to live in a world that didn't include him, which was very unexpected and beyond incomprehensible. Even now, 2 years later, there are times when it doesn't feel like I've fully accepted that. And this story felt very inspired by just everything that he loved. He loved sailing. He loved the ocean. He was in the United States Navy, and that was something he was very proud of. He had a military funeral, and his family is from Ireland and Wales. So a lot of the world building was heavily influenced by Ireland and by Wales and by the cultures and concepts and languages that they have. And I think some of the more intimate scenes were a little bit personal. There's a scene in particular where I think it's chapter 2, where Cordelia is on the ship and they're having the services and the cannon goes off and her whole body kind of reacts. And that was me during my father's funeral. My husband had worked with the local honor guard, and they had come to the funeral to do the salute, and he had a full military funeral. And I knew that they were going to shoot the gun during taps, but the expectation versus the reality is very different. Like, you can know, okay, there's going to be a gunshot happening. I don't think until you're in a completely silent, vulnerable space and 8 of them go off at once, you know what the impact that has is. And to this day, like when I hear taps, my body jolts because I immediately think of that second note of taps when the guns went off the first time. And it was just a complete reverberation throughout my whole body. So a lot of my experiences with grief and the emotional sort of life that I had during that 2-year period while writing the book and while experiencing this new world I was living in found their way into the book and found their way into the process, which is why I feel like grief, especially in the first half of the book, is almost a secondary character. It's not just an emotion that that Cordelia and Jaspar have to deal with. It's almost a secondary character, and it has its own evolution before we finally get to a place where we feel a little bit more comfortable with it.
Did you find it cathartic in writing about loss while going through it yourself?
Yeah. Especially because if you take a step back and you look at books, movies, TV shows, grief is not something we face head on. Grief is something that is pushed to the side. Even Marissa, if you look at the Lunar Chronicles, she loses her sister, the only human being in the world that loves her. She loses her sister, I think like 7 or 8 chapters in, and she never deals with that. It's constantly like, I miss my sister, but, I got to save the planet from this evil queen on the moon. So, I push it to the side. Tracy Wolff wrote the Crave series, and she does it beautifully by creating this compartmentalization process where the main character, every time she's confronted with the grief of losing her parents, she says, I'm going to put that in a folder called shit I can't deal with right now. But in terms of like actually full on facing, what is it like to deal with grief when you don't have a world to save, when you don't have a queen to overthrow, when you don't have a castle full of vampires and werewolves? What do you actually have to do when you're going through that experience? I didn't feel like that was available in literature or TV shows or movies. I didn't feel like that was something that was present in those spaces. So when I first started to write the book, I think it was chapter 5 or 6, when I noticed a pattern where I was adding those little moments to the story as I went. And I realized if I was going to write a story where the main character lost her father, if I was going to include that, it needed to be a part of the story. It couldn't just be she lost her dad and this is her life after. It needed to be, what was that grieving process like and how did she survive it?
After you said that, it's really true. Like, all of these characters in these books really do, like, yes, they're grieving, but it's like they're the chosen ones, so then they have to deal with all this chosen one stuff, and they really don't sit with their grief unless it's like bits and pieces here. So I definitely did appreciate how you did that, and you can definitely tell, like, we talked about it in our review, like the visceral reaction that you have reading that. Like, if you've remotely gone through grief, regardless of what kind of grief that is, like, I think you will have a reaction reading that part. Those parts, I should say, not even that part, those parts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we also talked about on our show how excited we were to read the upcoming books in this series, and we know that book 2 already came out and book 3 is about to come out. Are there any other books that you're working on that you can talk about after you finish book 3?
I don't know in terms of like, nobody said I can't talk about it. But I
love that answer for us. Love it.
I am working on another project right now that takes place in the same world but focuses on different characters.
Ooh.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's Cordelia.
How
and
dare you
Jaspar's-
dangle that worm in
I
front of
know. Cordelia and Jaspar
Listen,
have
Barbara, it
a
is par for the
wonderful
course.
ending. But there are other characters, and honestly, they were throwaway characters that were supposed to have a one-off mention in book 2. And for whatever reason, when I got done writing More Than Love, I still had them in my mind. And as like a fun for myself, I was like, all right, maybe I'll write a couple chapters just for fun. And I sort of sat back and looked at what I had written, and I emailed my publisher and I was like, hey, I'm pretty sure I got a duology here if you want it. So I am working on something. I haven't been told I can't say anything. So I don't,
Nice. Yes,
I don't know
that's
what I
fair.
can say.
We're gonna get a cease and desist letter before this
Right.
podcast goes live.
They're gonna make us like redact our
Right.
podcast.
Right.
Edit
I won't
those
say
parts,
I won't say
please.
who it's about. I'll let you guys decide who you think. There are 2 main characters. I will let you guys, have a conversation about who you think those characters might be. But it does take place in the same universe.
Oh, that's exciting.
Interesting.
I know. That's a hell of a dangle there, I must
Listen,
say.
Barbara, just let us get to the spoilers, and we'll talk about how Bethany likes to do that to us.
Yeah, we got Lauren particularly got some bones to pick with you.
You and my mom both.
I know you and I have talked a little bit about this before, but it's funny because I didn't really know this was a thing until once again Marissa Meyer mentioned it in her podcast. FYI, this is totally like a plug for her podcast. If y'all don't listen to it, you really should. I think it's an amazing podcast about writing and the writing process, and it's really cool that she gets these authors of all over the place. So literally like really well known or first time author and stuff like that. So I really do think if you're interested in that side or you just enjoy books, I think you'd really like her podcast. Anyways, I didn't realize what a plotter or a pantser was until I was listening to her podcast, like whenever she first started. And then that was so interesting. So I'm curious to know which one you are.
So I am a pantser in a very chaotic way. So a pantser means that you write by the seat of your pants. You just write. You don't have an outline. You don't have a plan. You just start typing and you see what happens. I do have notes on my phone that are just very chaotic, jumbled words that sort of make sense to me and don't really make sense when I try to look at them a second time a couple of weeks later.
Like, what is this note?
But even my world building is by the seat of my pants. I remember writing a scene with Anchorage Inn, like the very first scene I wrote, she just stopped there, got a room, and then the next day she went to Woodvale, which I don't think is a huge spoiler because anybody listening to that one sentence is going to have no idea what I'm talking about.
No, yeah.
But I stopped midway through writing it so I could go online and do research and figure out like, well, what would a tavern have looked like in, 1699? And I looked through probably an hour of data and content on the internet and then went back because I realized there's no such thing as a tavern or an inn. There was both. If you had a tavern, you had rooms where people could sleep. If you had an inn, you had a place where people could eat. They were always the same structure at that historical time. And so it sort of became this perfect way for her to have somewhere to sleep and somewhere to go. And that led to this entire secondary location. Like a good portion of the book takes place at Anchorage Inn. It is the focal point of the city of Alaro. And when I was researching, all of that came into the book, and I would stop and, okay, she's outside. What's the temperature like at 9:00 in Ireland in the middle of July? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it windy? Well, she's by the ocean. Does that have an impact on the temperature? Yes, it drops the temperature by about 20 degrees every night, if anybody cares. So a lot of that sort of found its way into the world building process because I would stop researching and go back to the story with all this new information. But I'm definitely a pantser. I wish I could be a plotter because I know that I know that there's this idea and concept that a plotter is like really well organized. But in terms of writing, I just kind of write. That's probably why I'm such a prolific writer, because I want to know what happens too, and I don't until I type it out.
I'm glad that you defined pantser, because when I saw it on Barbara's like question notes, all I could think about was like middle school and like the people that would run up behind the guys
like a deep pant, like two deep pants.
Yeah. That's all I could think of. I was like, where's this going?
No, because there's two types of writers. The main types is a plotter, someone who has like an outline and a clear idea and expectation before they start writing, and they follow their outline and their plan. And then a pantser like myself, we fly by the seat of our pants. There are people that do both that are kind of somewhere in the middle.
A hybrid.
Yeah, I'm not really, I do have ideas of like, oh, I wonder if the book should end here. Like, for example, the cliffhanger to book 1, I wrote that about a third of the way through the book. I just didn't know how I was going to get there. But it wasn't an outline or a plan. I just wrote that scene, thought it was great, and was like, this would be a really cool way to end the book on like a really great cliffhanger. And then I didn't touch it until I finished the book. So, I just don't have that structure that I think people anticipate. And it's the same in academics. When I was working on my master's degree, I would write my entire essay like in 2 days because I'm not good at stopping and trying to figure out where I left off 3 days later, or 5 days later, or a week later. I just keep going until it's done. So even like with essays, I don't have like an outline or anything. I just start writing it.
I didn't realize people had outlines for essays.
Yeah,
I mean, you have to in school, or you're supposed to.
Oh,
right,
nope.
and it's hard. It's hard because I just start writing. I'm like, this isn't outline.
Exactly.
This is just the whole essay. Yeah. So you're probably more of a pantser, Barbara.
Apparently,
Yes.
That's funny. I didn't even think of that. But like in school, I've never plotted anything
I was always
out or
a plotter.
outlined.
Well, that's not true. I was a plotter when it came to academic writing, and a pantser when it came to like literary writing.
I think I would be the opposite of that. That's funny how that works. So you mentioned like the research that you did. What did you have to do a lot of research, or did you find yourself doing a lot of research for, I guess, the world building, or just to make it more livable, maybe?
I think a lot of the research came into play because of the type of writer that I am. I like senses. I like to know what a space smells like and sounds like and feels like, and what the temperature is and what kind of material they would have used. And because I focused a lot on those sensory details as a writer, I needed to do research. Not every writer has that kind of detail. Marissa, for example, is one of my favorite writers. She doesn't do a lot of sensory focus. But I focused a lot on what does it smell like? What does it feel like? Even just her going from her home to Anchorage Inn, the bed was different because it was made of different material and she had different blankets. The smell was different because she was in a different location in the same village, but just, she went from being right next to the ocean in this manor home to being next to the ocean, but like it's above a stable at a bar. So I think that for me, the research process is more about the world building than necessarily about structure or content. In the last book, I had to do a lot more research on, I'm trying not to give away spoilers, on technical things. I had to do some technical research. And that lent itself to a lot of really great ideas that didn't find their way into the story, hence why I'm now working on a spinoff.
I was going to ask, do you just kind of tuck that away for maybe a later book then? Is that?
I mean, there's some things from this book that got cut for one reason or another that found their way into the second book in a dream or in a flashback, or found their way into the third book from a different person's perspective, or even from a different scene. So there's always room. I always tell people, like, if you're a writer, don't ever backspace, just, cut it out and save it on a document for later, because you never know when you're going to want that back. It could be 3 years later and you're going to be like, didn't I write a scene that was similar to this? Let me go back and look at it. So I don't unless it's like a couple of words, I don't backspace. If it's more than a paragraph, I cut it, I copy and paste it into a new document. I save it in a folder that's like deleted scenes, and then I can go back to it later if I feel like there's something there that might be salvageable in another story or in another universe.
Good sage advice there, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
So when you're writing, what typically comes first to you, like plot or characters? Like when you're starting a new world or a new novel, or just thinking about that piece, what do you like tend to get a character and then that you form the story around them, or is it the other way around?
It's usually a little bit of both. For this particular story, the character came first, but then once I started writing, the entire world changed and the character is completely different. Originally, this was a contemporary novel, and she had a lot of siblings, and she had parents and aunts and uncles and cousins, and I found that while I was writing it, science and technology really got in the way of having a mythical island. And so when I switched it to historical fantasy, the entire character changed and adjusted. And I think I was on chapter 8 when I realized she needed a new name and a new identity. So it can be both. It can be either or. Sometimes it's the world lends itself into the character. Sometimes the character makes me change the world itself. A lot of the world building adjusted when I added Jaspar to the mix, and when I realized he had a curse, for example, and that there was magic in the world, that changed a lot of the world I had already built. I had to go back and, okay, now it's not just historical fantasy. There's actual magic and structure. So how do I layer that throughout the book? So it's a little bit of both.
Also, I didn't realize that's how you pronounce his name. We might need a pronunciation
sorry.
guide. So it's not Jasper, it's Jaspar. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I think that I don't think
I definitely
it matters.
read it as Jasper.
Yeah. I don't think it matters. I think that one of the greatest things about literature is that everything is pronounced differently or thought of as differently. But technically, I pronounce it as Jaspar, which is why Jazz is such an easy nickname. And then some of the villages and cities and places like Woodvale, I don't think that requires a pronunciation. I do pronounce it Mykeria instead of Mykeria because my dad's name is Mike and it was expired by his name, so Mykeria. But I have a couple people that call it Mykeria, and I'm like, that's fine. It's not like a huge hill for me to climb as long as people find a way to read the book. I am not sort of bogged down on pronunciation.
I was going to say, some authors would probably.
Yeah, some authors are very particular about that, and I've had those conversations. And but to me, it's like part of enjoying a book is having your own experience with it and your own imagination, and that goes into the words and the languages that are used as well.
It's funny because I feel like anytime we're reading like a fantasy novel, we're like, how do you say these names? And we're always like tumbling over it, and then I always ask them because they're more of the audio readers than me, and so I'm like, how did the audiobook pronounce this name? Because this is what I did in my head, and they're like, no, it's this way. And it's really hard, like once you start reading a book and you start pronouncing it in your way, to like change it to whatever it's supposed, quote unquote, the right way to say it. And so I find that interesting. This is totally a satisfying question for myself. Have a lot of people commented about any of the Taylor Swift references in your book? Like, have you had a lot of people mention that at all to you?
Not as many as I would like.
No, how dare they?
And one other person.
Okay.
But it is very subtle. If you're not a Taylor Swift fan, I don't think they'll pick up on it. One of them, for example, my mom was like, well, give me an example of something that's like a really subtle reference. And I said, confused and frustrated. And she's like, what? And I was like, that's a lyric. She's like, that's just like a common use of words. And I was like, but if you're a Swiftie, you're singing it in your head right now. So, so there are little tiny nuances that I think Swifties will pick up on. And that was kind of intentional just because I thought it would be fun to put something. I am a Swiftie, right? So I love the idea of Easter eggs, and there is a ton of foreshadowing in book 1. But I thought it would be really fun, kind of like in her early albums, she used to capitalize like 1 or 2 letters here and there to create a sentence. So I thought it would be fun if I could toss in a couple lyrics or a couple references and see if anybody noticed. So just you and one other person.
That's fun. The whole time I was reading this, it was so hard for me to not reach out to you and be like, Taylor Swift reference? Taylor Swift reference? And then Michael, I was like, Michael, did you pick up on any of Taylor Swift reference? He's like, no. I was like, well, this one, and then this one here.
Right?
He's like, okay. So, of course, that I just had to ask about that one because I, too, am a Swiftie.
I love it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Bethany. Before we wrap this section up, can you let our listeners know where they can get a copy of More Than Life, a YA historical fantasy, and where they can find you on social media?
So you can find me everywhere at Bethany Finger Author. My name is Hebrew, so it's not spelled the way you think it is. It's Bethanie, Finger Author. And you can find More Than Life anywhere books are sold, and especially check it out at your local library or on Kindle Unlimited if you're hoping to get it at a discount price. But it is available everywhere, as are the sequels. And the last one comes out in 10 days from while we're recording, which is mind-boggling to me.
I bought the second one this morning before we sat down for this, so I'm excited to read it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so remember the second part of our podcast is going to include some huge spoilers for this book. So if you do want to read it and you haven't, then stop listening now and come back to listen to the second half of this interview once you're done.
My bulky blender was such a pain to use, I ended up hardly ever using it at all. But the BlendJet 2 portable blender makes blending so easy and convenient, I use it just about every day. BlendJet 2 is portable, so you can blend up a smoothie at work, a protein shake at the gym, or even a margarita at the beach. It's small enough to fit in a cup holder, but powerful enough to blast through tough ingredients like ice and frozen fruit with ease. BlendJet 2 is whisper quiet, so you can make your morning smoothie without waking up the whole house. It lasts for 15 plus blends and recharges quickly via USB-C. Best of all, BlendJet 2 cleans itself. Just blend water with a drop of soap and you're good to go. With over 30 plus colors and patterns to choose from, there's a BlendJet 2 to complement just about any style. I rock the ruby metallic print myself because I'm clearly a certified badass. What are you waiting for? Go to blendjet.com and grab yours today, and be sure to use the promo code BADALitPod12, that's BADALitPod12, to get 12% off your order and free 2-day shipping. No other portable blender on the market comes close to the quality, power, and innovation of the BlendJet 2. They guarantee you'll love it or your money back. Blend anytime, anywhere with the BlendJet 2 portable blender. Go to blendjet.com and use the code BADALitPod12 to get 12% off your order and free 2-day shipping. Shop today and get the best deal ever.
It is critically important to stay hydrated. I know I'm always trying to be better about drinking more water. Well, I've got a product that helps you stay hydrated. Liquid IV is the category-winning hydration brand fueling your well-being, and their hydration multiplier is the one product you're missing in your daily routine. In just one stick, you get 5 essential vitamins and 2 times faster hydration than water alone. Use it first thing in the morning, before a workout, when you feel run down, after a long night out, or even on long flights. It's festival season, and planning for faster, efficient hydration is essential. Liquid IV has you covered while you prep before, power through to the headliner, and recover after the weekend. Liquid IV hydrates 2 times faster than water alone and 3 times the electrolytes of traditional sports drinks. What I love most about Liquid IV is that it's super easy to take with you, and personally I love the strawberry flavor, but all the ones that I've tried are pretty great. Also, it's made with premium ingredients. It's non-GMO, and it's free from gluten, dairy, and soy. And the company does some really cool things, too. Liquid IV believes that equitable access to clean and abundant water is the foundation of a healthier world. They partner with leading organizations for innovative solutions to help communities protect both their water and their futures. To date, Liquid IV has donated over 39 million servings in 50-plus countries around the world. Get 20% off when you go to liquidiv.com and use our special code BADASS at checkout. That's 20% off anything you order when you shop Better Hydration today using our special promo code BADASS, all one word, at liquidiv.com. But for those of you sticking around for the spoilers, here we go. So how long would you say it took you to write this first book?
Okay, no judgment. 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh,
Wow.
seriously?
Yeah.
When you said no judgment, I was thinking you were going to be like 5 years.
No, there's a lot of people
3
that are like,
weeks.
no, that's not possible. Guys, when I say I did nothing but write this book, I did nothing but write this book. I was
Wow.
waking up at like 2 a.m. I was writing working at the North Las Vegas Library, and it got to this point where like if somebody saw me with my phone, my boss would be like, "Oh, she got an idea. What's she typing?" Because I would just like, "Oh wait, I gotta type this scene on my phone really quickly." And then the second book took about 6 weeks, and then the last book took about 9 months. So it was.
So you're like a Fast and Furious writer.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I am. I'm big on the first draft. I'm huge with that first draft. I just go all in and I write like crazy. And I'll write like 10,000 words a day and I won't do anything else. And I literally mean that. Like my husband will bring me food and be like, "Hey, I haven't seen you leave your desk in 6 hours. So like nutrients.
Please eat."
That's a keeper.
Touch grass. Drink water.
Touch the grass. Remind yourself that you're alive.
Yeah.
And then the last book it has so many different versions because I was so dedicated to giving these characters the ending that they deserved while keeping it interesting, of course. So the last book took a lot of work. And then when I finally got the contract, the first book was actually about 125,000 words. And they were like, "Yeah, no, it needs to be like 100. So I had to shorten it down a lot, which I think took about 2 months. And then I shortened it down. I think it was still like 107. And I messaged my publisher and I was like, please, can it just be 107? I don't know what to do at this point. And she's like, "Send me what you have." And she's like, "All right, I'll give you 110 because you cut out some of the things I really liked." So, so it just, it's just a matter of where my muses are going. But usually that first draft, I'm really quick with it.
That's insane. So that's not normal, right? Like that quick. I feel like normally it takes a lot longer. Or
I was just saying that there aren't many authors that write that quickly. Like I was talking about Brandon Sanderson, and he pumps out his books like insanely fast, and he says that no one else should compare themselves to him, but now Bethany should. I realized because she's writing at about the same speed. It seems like.
Yeah, it's.
I feel like though, if you're dedicated, like you got, and you don't have kids, and you don't have like, and you can just like lock yourself in a room and write.
Even with kids, you just be like, go over there, baby.
Feed and change your own diaper.
Yeah,
just take care of yourself. I gotta write. No, but I think that's awesome that you.
It just depends on the person. Like,
probably helps with writer's block too, because if you just never stop, then you can't have that issue. Okay, first of all, I guess to preface this, I loved the book, and if you've listened to our episode about the book, I have nothing but love for the book. But how dare you leave us on such a rage-inducing cliffhanger? I was shooketh. I was so mad. I texted both of them. I was like, what the hell? It obviously made me want to read the next one, but how dare you? That's all. That's all I know. Did you know?
There's no question.
The question is, my original question.
Lauren just needed to say that.
She just needed to say this to you.
I needed to get it off my chest. No. I mean, you kind of answered it earlier, I feel like, but my original question was like, did you know that you were going to do that to us when you started the book? Or did it come to you later?
So first I want to say thank you for using the word shooketh, because I use that all the time and I never hear other people say it. So I feel
we're in good company.
Yeah, I feel very camaraderie right now. No, I honestly didn't know I was going to leave it there for the longest time. And then I was about a third of the way through and I thought of that very last line. We're in the spoiler section?
Yes.
Okay, so the very last line where it says the ship is sinking and they're sinking with it. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. And I wrote it down. And then I came home and I told my husband, and I was like, how like mean would it be to like
so mean
end the book there? And he was like, I mean, you're trying to get people to read book 2, right? And I was like, yeah, but like as a reader, I'm kind of mad at myself. And he's like, but do you want people to read book 2? And so I played with it for a little bit. And then I was like, you know what? No, I'm the writer and I really love this. And then my critique partner, Heather Schneider, who wrote the Chasing Cheer duology, Meet Me in St. Louis, she read it and she sent me a message of just like, I hate you, but brilliant. Like, I am not happy with you, but that is brilliant. And I was like, okay, I'm on the right track. And then book 2, I have been told, is even better / worse.
Oh, no.
Bethany still loves me after that book. But the
That
good thing is I am a kind and gracious author, and you have to wait 1 month in between books. That's it. So at least there's not
That's
like
fair. Yeah.
this is not like a Game of
year.
Thrones situation where 17 years later you're still trying to figure out what happened after the boat sank.
Right.
Yes. We appreciate that. I do appreciate that. But I definitely, it was a moment of like, man, that was a really good move on an author's part, but damn it.
As a reader,
like,
hate
no.
it for us.
I will say that the general consensus I've received after book 2 has come out and people have started reading it is that the twist at the beginning is not what you will expect after getting that cliffhanger. Obviously,
okay.
there's a
now
twist
why'd you have to
after
do that to me?
Obviously, after that ending, there is a twist in the beginning of book 1 or in the beginning of book 2. But it was not one people had anticipated, which I was surprised by. I thought it was going to be kind of an obvious. So I'm really excited for you guys to get there and to find out like if you enjoyed that or not.
I mean, we did debate on how this would
play out.
There's another.
Yeah.
I have another question later.
Play out. Yeah. That's good.
Did when you were writing the book, did you find it difficult to write the chapters that were from Jaspar's perspective, like writing from a male perspective instead of a female perspective?
Not really. There were a few times when I would go to my husband and be like, "Do men think this way?" Especially because my husband is a relatively like taciturn person on the outside. Like I know him very well, right? Because I'm his partner. But to the outside world, he's like a very taciturn individual, kind of private. So there were definitely scenes where I was like, mentally, do men have this kind of navigation in their head? Because women, at least the women I've met and the woman that I am, that brain is on 24/7. There is no off button. We are always thinking of something. And I can't tell you the amount of times my husband is like, "Oh, I'm not thinking about much." And I'm like, "But what are you thinking about? Like in that little pocket of your head?" And he's like, "No, literally, when I say I'm not thinking about anything, I mean, my brain is this empty, clean slate. And I have to sort of, how do you live in a world that quiet?"
I was gonna say, what does that feel like?
It feels like my brain on Adderall. Oh man,
it was definitely it definitely made it more fun though to write from Jaspar's perspective, because also you get, especially in the beginning, like how annoyed he is that she's always complaining about stuff. And I think that the fun part of writing in Jaspar's perspective was just where women, I don't want to sound sexist, so I will say for where women, where myself, I'm constantly thinking in terms of emotions. Jaspar, when his mind goes into autopilot, it's all about the island and what's the next move? What am I looking for next? What's the next clue? Where should I be looking for the next clue? What was the last piece of information I had? Where is this obsession taking me? So it was a very different way of doing that sort of idle mindset. When I'm on autopilot, my brain is thinking about all these things I have to accomplish and what I have to get done and the emotion and turmoil of being a human. And so when Jaspar was on autopilot, it was all focused on the island, which is where the part of Cordelia got to be fun, because then Jaspar's brain has always been auto-focused on the island. Now all of a sudden this girl is starting to creep her way into his idle thoughts, and that's been very different for him. As a male, did you feel like it felt like a boy's perspective, or were you like, "Duh, this is a chick"?
This is a woman writing man how they wish we acted.
Right. I thought you did a good job. I think you did a good job writing from a male perspective. I was just curious if like kind of what your process was, and you answered that perfectly. So thank you.
Thank you. As far as I know, you're the only like male that I've gotten feedback from. So it's good to know I did okay with that boy perspective.
Dang,
yes, I think you did.
You're a unicorn in this.
Yes.
Hey.
You brought up the island, and we also obviously talked about the inn as well. But did you find it difficult to come up with the world building, or did any particular place kind of influence the world building?
So the world building of Myceria was very heavily influenced by Ireland and Wales, because that's where my father's family is from. And then Quilars, we don't really get to see a lot of what it's like there until the later books. So I don't want to give away a spoiler for those, but I will say that they were inspired a lot by the Faroe Islands.
Did you find any one particular character harder to write than the other, or were they all pretty easy, or did you find like one character super easy, maybe the other ones weren't as much?
Deuteramid was really easy because he's just this grumpy guy. Like, that's not hard. You just get to be in a headspace of like "Rawr" all the time. So Deuteramid was
Right,
really
intrusive thoughts
easy.
wins with him.
Right? Especially that scene like with him doing his puzzle. That was so much fun. I loved the idea that this grumpy old man on his night off is just like drinking whiskey and doing a puzzle. I think that in terms of like difficulty and perspective, Taylor was difficult. Taylor is a very taciturn individual, and he thinks in a very logistical way, in a very straightforward way. And so writing from his perspective, I had to really hone back the kind of vocabulary I was using, the kind of dialogue I was using, especially those scenes with him and Gladys where we get the slow reveal that they used to be betrothed to one another, because you would never notice that in the very beginning of their interactions. And so he was a little bit more difficult to write from his perspective, because I would go back and read through it and I'm like, this is too much emotion. Taylor doesn't think this way. The only time Taylor really shows those emotions is when it comes to Gladys or Cordelia. The rest of the time, he's a very straightforward thinker. So that was probably the hardest one to write, but it also made him, I think, more interesting as a character because his perspective is very easy to identify, you know, going from all the other characters, and then you're in Taylor's perspective and it's very clearly a different person.
Right.
I think you did a really good job, though, making it very distinct between the different people, though, too. That was one thing we
Thank
talked
you.
about in our review
Yes.
episode, so I
Yeah,
wanted to
'cause
say that here, too.
Sometimes authors, you're like, if you didn't have the name on top of the chapter, I wouldn't
Yeah.
have realized
Yeah.
we were swaching perspectives. So
There are
Yeah.
definitely books where I've had to do that, like go back to the beginning of the chapter and be like, wait, whose perspective am I reading now? But not yours.
Part of
so.
that I think is doing it in third person as opposed to using like the I, myself, me. I think doing it in third person helps a lot, because then you're not constantly using that first person pronoun and trying to remember whose name was at the beginning of the book. I think and I don't want to slash authors by saying this, but I think the only time I've enjoyed when it's first person narrative with different perspectives is if it's an audiobook and I get two narrators. Then it's super simple because I'm listening to two different voices. But words on a page, it's very difficult for me to transpire myself from one person to the other. So writing it, that was a really big goal of mine. So you guys just boosted my ego quite a bit by saying that.
So I'm not a huge fan of first person perspective books because I feel like you have to be really good at writing different voices to be able to switch that. So like if it's a book and it's just their perspective and it's first person, I normally don't have that much of a problem because I'm like, okay, easy enough. It's just one person. But when they try switching it over like that, I find it, if you're not good at writing different perspectives or making them very distinct, I struggle with that. And first off, you didn't write in first person. So, you know, there's that. But like, I do think I found it very easy to be like, oh, okay, I know exactly who I'm reading the perspective of throughout your book. And I didn't have to be like, oh my God, who is this? So I applaud you on that one. That was nice.
It definitely is difficult I imagine it's difficult to write distinctively enough to where the different point of views work well. Because I've read a lot of books. We've read a lot of books on the pod where like, there were different point of views and I'm like, man, I love a good different point of view book, but like this one just didn't hit because especially for audio, if you don't have the two narrators, for me, because I'm usually listening with my kids running around or whatever, if you don't have two different narrators or like the different voices for the different sections, it just gets really confusing and they run together. So this one didn't have that problem.
Originally the book was first person narrative from Cordelia's perspective. And I was about 7, maybe 5 chapters in, and I wanted to write a chapter from Jaspar's perspective, just as like a writing exercise so I could get to know him better as a character. And while I was writing it, I realized like the book had the potential to be a story that wasn't just about Cordelia and she finds her dad's apprentice and they look for an island. There was a potential for multiple characters here. And so I wrote that and I immediately went back to what I had already written. And I thought, well, what about this scene, but from Jaspar's perspective? What about what happens after this scene, but what's happening to Jaspar? Because Cordelia is her own separate story. And I was I was writing the funeral from Jaspar's perspective when I realized I had the potential for multiple perspectives. And then I was writing a scene with Cordelia after she'd gotten her job at Anchorage Inn. And I thought, like, well, what does Gladys think of this, like, girl trying to work here? Because I didn't want a Mary Sue situation where it's like, wow, she's just naturally the best bartender ever.
Right?
Like, I wanted this girl to struggle. Like, this girl has been a lady of society. She can't even tie her own corset. There's no way she's a fully fledged waitress in like a day.
Right.
So I was thinking, like, well, what's Gladys's perspective of like, ooh, I hired this girl. Was that a good move? And that's when I realized there was a potential for more than just Jaspar and Cordelia. I could do whatever perspective I wanted. And it worked out perfectly because there's all these chapters where obviously it would be great to get Cordelia and Jaspar's perspective for each chapter. But there were all these chapters where I was able to do like Taylor's perspective. So this is what's going on with Taylor and Mary while everybody else is at Anchorage Inn, or the Diarmid perspective. So it's like, well, this is what it's like when Diarmid is alone and people think he's just like grumpy and he's actually just like doing a puzzle by the fire. And I like to pretend he's got like the window slightly open and he's listening to the howling snow. And so that the multiple perspectives was a really great way for me to experience those characters and get to know them better. And then I like to think it made the story just that much better because now it's not just Cordelia's story. All of them have their own plot going on. Like even Gladys and Taylor have their own story outside of just Cordelia and Jaspar and this island. And I wanted these characters to be not just like, oh yeah, there's three brothers that go to the end. No, Trevian has his own life going on. And Iverson is always teasing Trevian. And Kevin is like, I should get married, but who really cares? Like, I wanted those characters to feel a little bit more real for me as the writer, because that's what lends to the world building. So I just have to, as an author, hope that that translates once it gets on the page and people start reading or listening to it.
No, I think it definitely did, especially because sometimes I feel like when I'm reading a book, the characters are just kind of thrown in for like plot purposes or like to take off a box. And because of the way you did it, I feel like I was invested in these side characters where normally sometimes like, you know, you're like, oh, okay, cool, side character here just to further the plot or to help the character along. Whereas at this point, it's like they feel lived in because of that. So
I also appreciated that because I think a lot of times the side characters are just plot devices to kind of further. But even this, I mean, maybe not the very smallest of side characters, but the majority of the side characters in this one had their own kind of storyline to where you at least felt connected to them in some way. It wasn't like just, oh, that's a random fisherman guy that we don't get to know anything about. Like we got enough background to be curious about them, and I think that that's hard to do, especially in 3 weeks. My mind is still blown.
Well, even just Trevian and Iverson, like they have this great dynamic where Iverson is always teasing Trevian, and so you assume that that's like there's no camaraderie there, right? And then you get to like closer to the end when Polly is like harassing Iverson, like, oh, he's got feelings and he believes in ghosts. Trevian is the first person to be like, no, not my brother. And I think that that's a nice little tidbit into the brothers and how they communicate with each other. And they are very side characters. They are not a main focus by any means, but because they're a part of that world, they get to be their own characters. And to me as an author, like I said, that's part of the world building is those characters are fully developed human beings. And they're not just there to like further the plot along. I would say, if anything, if I'm going to be like just an open book, the only person I could think of that may have been like to drive the plot was Mary. But even she has this tiny little arc with her and Gladys where, you know, they sort of fight for who's the most badass woman without actually fighting for who's the most badass woman. And Mary has to kind of bite her tongue when it gets right down to it, because Gladys is like, look, there's being supportive and then there's bossing her around, and you're bossing her around. So even someone as small as a character as Mary got to have that kind of growth.
That was definitely something that was noticed and appreciated when we read the book. It's nice to see fully fledged out side characters that aren't, like Barbara said, just there for plot. So let's see. I wanted to ask about the magic system that you came up with. How did you come up with? Obviously, we just got, I feel like, a little taste of the magic system in the first book, and hopefully we'll be getting more later on. But how did you come up with Yes. How did you come up with that? How did you come up with the magic system?
So this is the part of being a pantser that's really fun. There's a scene that got cut. There's a scene that got cut where they were in the boat and they had to cook the fish. And you can't like cook fish on a boat. And I thought, oh man, it would be so cool if they could like finger gun and point your like index finger and a ball of fire would like come out of your finger and light the fish. And now you have cooked fish for lunch. And then I wrote that scene and I was like, oh man, there's magic in the world. And that was like, I was like 60 to 70% of the way through the book at that point. So I had to go back and like, all right, well now we're doing magic. So the magic sort of became a part of the world because of that one moment. And then I thought, oh man, it would be so cool. And then the rest of the magic, it needed to be there for certain scenes. And I wanted it to be, I love when things are different, but not so different that it's like, whoa, she's trying to be different. Which is why I like interchange the word Thurgist and mage. Like there's a mage, but there's also a Thurgist. A mage is just someone who has this power over like, you know, weather, or maybe they're a really good seamstress, or maybe they're really great when it comes to building and carpentry. But then there's also these extremely talented elemental magics like Danthums who have power over water, and Kliegbill who has power over metal, and Jaspar who has power over fire. And that's more of a Thurgist level because that's a very high level of like magical use and magical properties. And so when I was writing scenes of like, I didn't want it to just be like, she's a water user, he likes fire. So I was like searching through like, well, what's the Welsh word for fire? What's the Gaelic word for water? Like, and then I ended up just adding a letter here or removing a letter there and manipulating it. When I wrote the goons, originally it was just, you know, guys in cloaks with a bow and arrow. And then I thought, well, they need to have like a name. They can't just be like the goons. So I started like looking up names and I thought, oh, fish hunter, that's a cool name, Sidon, and it means fish hunter. And then I was like, well, then they can't just be goons that call themselves fish hunters. Like they need to be magical. And so I made them these slimy green creatures with fins and like pointy, greasy, dirty teeth. And so a lot of the magic and world building, it just became a part of this story because while I was writing, I felt like a scene needed a little bit more to be real or to be, you know, have a higher factor, or this isn't intense enough. There needs to be more on the line here. And then she became a water user because of plot. I was writing this scene where she was in the forest and she was like attacking the Sidons, who originally were just bandits. They didn't even have anything to do with Janus. They were just bandits. And I wrote this scene and I thought, oh, it would be so cool if the water could like come out of the creek and attack the bandits, and then it goes back to the creek and she's just like, woohoo, I'm safe, and she gets to leave. And then it turned into this, well, who's controlling the water? Why do they have the power to do that much with water? Is this a rare gift? Is it a common gift? Is it like a common gift, but for some reason her power is higher than most, so it's unique in that way? And that's when I came to the idea of, you know, having this Kustos and this life charm that, because if she is a water user, she's almost 20 years old. Why has she never noticed this amazing power before? Well, now we have the Kustos and the life charm and her getting tossed into the water and her father always saying, I love you more than life itself. And when I realized all of that could be a part of the world building, it really lent itself to creating this more developed concept of magic than just like, oh yeah, there's magic and fantasy because it's a fantasy book.
So what you're saying is originally you didn't think about the magic system, and now I'm extremely impressed how you integrate it into the story, realizing that, to be honest with you. In 3 weeks, like Lauren mentioned.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of editing that, you know, those first 3 weeks, the manuscript I think was about 90,000 words, 92, and it was my nano project. So there was definitely a lot of editing that happened after that came in and out. But the magic being with the fire and cooking of the fish, I just thought it would be really cool if someone could point their finger and fire would come out. And then I was like, well, if I have that in the book, then there has to be, like, he can't be the only one that has magic in the whole book.
Right.
So yeah, it just became this thing of well, you know, maybe that magic is how he gets remembered. Maybe it's not she's the only one who can remember him. Maybe
Mhm.
it's he's got this cool talisman and amulet. And that was because I was watching a lot of Charmed and they have amulets in like every 5 episodes. So I thought, all right, well, can I do anything with an amulet instead of calling it an amulet? Okay, well, I can call it a talisman and it can have this. And the only person who can make it is Cleekbeal because we find out later he's a Gitter and he's the first one in 1,000 years. So like, you know, there's all these wonderful concepts you can come up with if you just say it's magic.
Right. Because
So will we see any fire throwing, water yielding babies in the future?
Babies, I don't know, but definitely there's more magic in the next 2 books.
Fair enough.
I mean, that's what we were talking about. We're like, okay, if there's fire and water, obviously there's the other elements. So we
They're
definitely
coming.
will, we'll definitely
Yeah.
meet characters who can do,
Doesn't
earth,
know,
maybe
you know, we've got
air
these
or
love
something.
stories. Maybe there's going to be some, you know.
Yeah, I don't want to give away any spoilers for book 2 or book 3 or the spinoff. So we'll just say who
That's
knows.
fair.
Fair enough.
You'll find out in a month when book 3 comes out. How's that?
That's fair. I think we need somebody to recommend us book 2 on the pod officially so that we can read that, or maybe I'll just read it.
Bethany, you can recommend book 2 for the podcast right now.
I recommend More Than Legend and More Than Love. They're super cheap. It's like $2.99 for the ebooks if you want to. My husband has been telling people when they're like, "Oh, I don't have money for books." He's like, "Yeah, but the ebook is really cheap, and you can be like, I'm environmental friendly."
Exactly. Look at all this paper you just saved.
Yes.
But there is a huge paper shortage right now, so that's partly why I do encourage people like, "Oh, I prefer paperbacks." I'm like, I know, but you know, with the huge paper shortage going on and the ebooks, I'm all about it. Go for the ebooks. Don't feel like you have to do paperback because it makes you a real book lover. That's not a thing.
Right, exactly.
Barbara had asked earlier, if there was a character that was particularly easy or hard to write. Was there a scene or a section of the book that you found the hardest for you to write?
The opening chapter was very difficult. It's almost exactly what happened, with the exception of I'm not a lady. But it's almost the exact reaction I had when I found out that my father had passed away. My stepmother called my husband while he was at work because she couldn't bear talking to me and my sisters. So my husband had to tell me and my sisters what happened. And originally, I thought he was talking about his own father. And then I didn't believe that it was my dad. I had just talked to my dad. Like, I went to grab my phone. I was like, I'm going to call my dad right now. He's fine. Like, I just texted him a little while ago. So the first scene was very difficult. It had very little editing. I have not looked at it a lot. I hope it's still good. I don't know. But right down to the fact where she screams so much that she loses her voice, that happened to me. I lost my voice for several days because I could not stop screaming. So that was a very difficult scene to write. And then scenes that I loved writing the scene where they were fighting on the dock. That was so much fun. I love getting to, as someone who's been in a relationship for like a really long time, I think one of the greatest things about that is, you know, you can say things and you're going to be mad at each other, but later you won't be, and it's fine. So I thought it would be really interesting to have that moment in the book where I think a lot of authors would be like, oh, they're going to split up now. We have to try to get them back together. And instead they just fight and they say a lot of really rough stuff to each other. And then he's like, have you forgiven me? And she's like, I mean, not yet. Like, there's still a lot going on here. But we get that implication that like she's going to forgive him. It's not like a moment through in the story when you're like, man, they're never going to talk again after this fight. And then, of course, it was really interesting to write because we got his perspective for some of the argument, and then we got her perspective for some of the argument. And we get to see that they both have very valid points. Cordelia is just a little bit more like, I'm in the right here. There's no way I did anything wrong. And Jaspar is like, okay, I'm a jerk. I get it. But like, hey, you do not have a halo over your head. Like, you made a couple of mistakes as well, girl. So yeah, just that whole scene was a lot of fun to get to play around with.
Hey, we gotta love flawed characters. I hate when they're squeaky clean and perfect. It's just unreal.
There's no squeaky clean in these books. Even Taylor, you're like, dude, let go of your resentment.
Right? No crap. I'm like, just kiss her already. Love her. Bringing it back down a slight thing, but I just remember you mentioning in your author's note section of at the end that writing this book was a grief journey for you personally as well, like you mentioned, which I think takes a huge amount of courage, and I like to commend you for that because I feel like that would be hard doing that. But can you talk to us about the process of creating the characters and how they were maybe informed by parts of yourself in your own grief journey? I know you've mentioned that a little bit here, but like, did you find that you were kind of putting parts of yourself into these characters to maybe deal with the grief, or was it just that's what you wanted to focus on with the overall story?
I think that there's not really parts of myself in the characters, but there's parts of myself in grief, which is why I felt like it was a secondary character in the series, especially because there's scenes where I wrote exactly what I was feeling. Like there's a scene where Jaspar and Cordelia are talking and they come to this realization that grief is not temporary. And that's because that was a realization I had to come to. I even now I have people that are sort of surprised that I'm still struggling with accepting the loss of my father. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and she was like, well, do you feel like you'll ever get over it? And I came to this realization that like, that's not a thing. Grief is not something I think I wrote that I don't remember what I wrote. But I know in my experience, grief is not something that you go through and you make it out on the other side and you're like a better person or something. Grief it's always there. Sometimes it's really loud and it's the only thing you can think about. And sometimes it's just a thought in the back of your head. But for me, it is not something that I've been able to experience and move forward with my life. And so when I was writing these characters, I was thinking about, she just lost her dad and she's living this whole new life. Like, what does that look like from the perspective of someone who just lost their dad? Like, is she worried about, what her dad might think of these decisions? Is she worried about what her dad might think of this new lifestyle? Does she wish she could tell her dad about it? Is she slightly, nervous about that kind of conversation and what it would have looked like if he were still alive? And then with Jaspar, he was experiencing the loss of a man that he trusted and looked up to and saw as like a role model. And that was a little bit more of my husband's perspective, because they didn't have the typical father-in-law, son-in-law where they don't get along. Like my husband and my dad got along really well, and they were always doing like boy stuff together. And my dad had all girls. So I think my husband was like a really fun opportunity for my dad to be like, let's go mudding and let's work on stuff in the garage. And so it was writing that perspective of like, well, what's it like when you lose someone who's not your dad, but could be like a father figure to you? And then with Cordelia, a lot of it came down to, she has this whole new life and she is just working like crazy. She's not doing a very good job, but she's working like crazy. But she's not doing tasks that require a lot of mental thought. Cleaning a bedpan, you don't have to concentrate on that. Scrubbing laundry, chucking oysters, like that is not something that takes a lot of mental strain. So where are her thoughts leading her while she's working on these tasks? And that's where being a girl comes into play. And where does your mind lead you when you're not doing things? If you're already in an emotional state, then your mind is thinking about those emotional components of your life. And for Cordelia, those emotional components were dealing with her grief. And the advice that Gladys gives her, where she says, like, right now, that's the only thing you're thinking about, but someday it'll be the second and the third. That was something I had experienced. I had one of my aunts had told me that after she lost her mom, she realized that one day she was actually going to miss the grieving process. And I didn't realize what she meant. And then there was a day I woke up and I didn't think about it for like the first 20 minutes of the day. And I realized what she was saying. There's a day where you come to the realization that you've accepted what's happened. And that actually is almost harder than the first reaction, because now you have to really identify and look within yourself of how you're going to deal with this emotional turmoil and how you're going to move forward with it. And what I've learned as a human living in the world is just that you need to be a little bit kinder to yourself, and you need to allow yourself, like, you know what, I'm sad and I don't need to apologize for that. And Cordelia lives in a society where you're not supposed to show emotion at all. She is a lady. She is not supposed to be happy, sad, mad, anything. She is supposed to be poised and confident and working at the inn. Even those days where she struggles, she has to constantly like, no, put up the face, you're fine, it's all good. Which is something Jaspar connects with, because as someone who has no living memory, people can't remember him. So he's sort of built up his own walls and mechanisms to protect his emotional well-being. So I don't necessarily think that the characters were developed in that way with influences from me, but definitely the emotional components of grief were things that I experienced and I'm still experiencing now.
Yeah, I definitely got that, in the sense that it was very easy to understand how they were feeling as someone who's gone through grief as well. So I was like, yeah, this is it. Like that is. And I remember like highlighting stuff. I'm like, yes, this is a great quote about how this is, and this, I can understand this one. And I really like the quote that you mentioned with Gladys, like, you know, one day you'll notice that it's not like the first thing you think of, it's the second one, and maybe it'll transition to maybe the third thing. Or like you said, like later on, 2-3 years down the line, you're thinking about it, and it's not like, oh, hey, like I miss them or something like that. It's more like, if they were here, would my actions and what I'm doing or what I'm creating with my life now, not having them here, like how would they feel about that? So I want to say I think you did a really good job with that. And
we talked about this in the episode.
I really appreciate that, because I have one of my first reviews was that the grief was a bit much and that they didn't like that part of the book. So it means a lot to me that it was able to resonate with someone else in any small way, because that really is my experience. I've been trying to get published for 16 years, and I queried like 50 projects, and it is very bittersweet that the project that finally got published is something I never would have written if I hadn't lost my father.
Right.
Yeah, I think we talked about it in the episode that we did on the book. Like, I think that there was a section in there where I gave kind of a shout out, or like a just commending you for being courageous enough to share that piece, but then also just as a human who's experienced grief, but then also as a therapist, like so many books skirt over it, or like don't, like the characters just, oh, I gotta put on a whatever face, and like it's never really addressed. And I think people who read this book are going to be able to see a more realistic point of view from grief. And just, I think as a therapist that works with people who are going through grief, like getting for them to be able to like read that in a book and not just have the trope of, oh, like put on a happy face, move on, like those sorts of things. I think it's going to connect with a lot of people, and it's going to be meaningful to a lot of people, because it doesn't go away. So I definitely appreciated that from both perspectives.
I really appreciate that. I haven't gotten feedback from a like educated professional, so I'm glad that what I wrote was a little bit more relatable, because that's part of why sharing these types of stories is important, because you don't feel seen until you get to navigate that. And even the small things, I had someone message me, there's a scene where Cordelia like slams a door by accident and she says sorry to the door. And I had someone message me like, oh, I feel so seen right now. I apologize to inanimate objects all the time.
Yes.
So even just small things like that, like if somebody can resonate with any small moment in the book, then I think as an author, that's exactly why we want to share our story with the world.
Yeah, to the person who said that's too much grief, it's like, okay, I'm sorry, but sometimes books need to have that kind of stuff, because the glossing over it isn't to some people it might be a normal reaction to compartmentalize, put it away, and then go save the world. But for most of us who don't have that going on, like that is a very normal process. And to see that actually written in a book is kind of nice, honestly. It's like a breath of fresh air, as they say, just because you normally don't see that. They're like, okay, now I get to stab these people and all this stuff. And then it's like later when they're, covered in blood and thinking about life, when they're like, oh, okay, well, maybe this wasn't the best way of dealing with this and blah, blah, blah. And then like they move forward with life. And I'm like, okay, well, cool. You just lost your whole family in your town. The world's burning, but okay, cool.
Those storylines contribute to the idea that, or basically just the normalization of a trauma response being, because the trauma response is, I'm going to not feel this, I'm going to put it away, and we're going to just move on. And so when you read that and you consume that in media, like it becomes Like when you are a grieving person, you're like, well, something's wrong with me because why am I not able to do this? Because that's what's comfortable. So I'm sure that the person who wrote that review was more just like, oh man, this is uncomfortable. Like I'm having to experience real grief for a minute. So
all right, for our final question, we wanted to give you, Bethany, the chance to partake in our Badass Character Award that we do on every one of our review episodes. In each one, we pick the most badass character from that book. But to put a little fun spin on this, since we're talking about your book, and I feel like it wouldn't be fair to ask you who the most badass character in your own book
but
is.
she could still tell us too. As
you could still
FYI.
tell us.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you, who do you consider the most badass character from any book that you've read, and why?
From any book I've read?
Any book, yeah.
And then also your book, because
and then
yeah, because I am curious too. I didn't realize Michael was like any book. I was like, or your book right now that we just read, because I'm curious to know who you think. But
I don't want to spend too much time thinking about it. So for some reason, the person that comes to mind is Fleur Delacour from the Harry Potter series.
Nice.
And I'm thinking that specifically because I really love the scene where he gets bitten by the werewolf and she's like, you know what? I'm good looking enough for the both of us. Who cares what he looks like?
Yes.
I love a woman who knows her worth and doesn't really care about the side effects of life. And doesn't really let that tarnish her happily ever after. So I don't know why, but that's the first person that came to my mind. So
it's a good hook.
It's a good answer.
The movies didn't do her justice.
They did not.
I mean, a lot of the women characters. Yeah, I was like, a lot of the women charters they didn't really.
They got boiled down.
Yeah, we can have a whole TED talk about this. I'm sure
that would be like a whole podcast.
We should sit down and talk about our feelings.
I think
that could be its own podcast right there.
I think we just planned a bonus episode.
Right?
Future bonus episode here. No.
Absolutely.
And what about for your book?
The first person that comes to mind on my book would be Gladys.
Oh,
this is a girl who
gave up.
Yeah, this is a girl who gave up the future she wanted for herself to take care of her family, and then in a society that is extremely male dominated, she has run her own very established and respected business for almost 30 years, and there is not a person in that town that would mess with her. And I never had to say that. When you're reading it, I never had to be like, she is badass. Like, you just know that girl is
you just know. Yes.
Yep.
She just
secondary
has that
character. She was my favorite.
Yeah. So yeah,
yes, Gladys.
The person that comes to mind would definitely be Gladys, especially because later we see Phyllis, and she's just like so calm and quaint. And do you guys want some tea? Whereas Gladys is hitting people with a tankard because they were rude to her waitress. Like, yeah, definitely Gladys.
Nice. Well, we really appreciate you joining us on the pod. Before we wrap this up, can you let our listeners know one more time where they can get a copy of your book and then where they can find you on socials?
So you can find me everywhere on social media at Bethany Finger Author. More Than Life is available everywhere you get books, and you can easily find it on Kindle, of course. It's only $2.99 there, but you can also request it at your local library. I always encourage that one because I am a librarian.
Have feedback about today's episode, you can contact us by writing to badassliteraturesociety@gmail.com. You can also send us a DM or leave a comment on Instagram or Facebook.
Make sure you're following Badass Literature for free in your favorite podcast app. Give us a rating and leave us a review if they allow you to. It means a lot when we get those. And also, don't forget to be following us on social media. Our username on both Instagram and Facebook is at BadassLitPod. And with that, we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.